Braxton Bragg was a career United States Army officer, and then a general in the Confederate States Army, a principal commander in the Western Theater of the American Civil War and later the military advisor to the Confederate President Jefferson Davis. Bragg, a native of North Carolina, was educated at West Point and became an artillery officer. He served in Florida and then received 3 brevet promotions for distinguished service in the Mexican-American War, most notably the Battle of Buena Vista. He established a reputation as a strict disciplinarian, but also as a junior officer willing to publicly argue with and criticize his superior officers, including those at the highest levels of the Army. After a series of posts in the Indian Territory, he resigned from the U.S. Army in 1856 to become a sugar plantation owner in Louisiana. During the Civil War, Bragg trained soldiers in the Gulf Coast region. He was a corps commander at the Battle of Shiloh and subsequently was named to command the Army of Mississippi. He and Edmund Kirby Smith attempted an invasion of Kentucky in 1862, but Bragg retreated following the inconclusive Battle of Perryville, Kentucky, in October. In December, he fought another inconclusive battle at Murfreesboro, Tennessee, the Battle of Stones River, but once again withdrew his army. In 1863, he fought a series of battles against Maj. Gen. William S. Rosecrans and the Union Army of the Cumberland. In June, he was outmaneuvered in the Tullahoma Campaign and retreated into Chattanooga. In September, he was forced to evacuate Chattanooga, but counterattacked Rosecrans and defeated him at the Battle of Chickamauga, the bloodiest battle in the Western Theater, and the only major Confederate victory therein. In November, Bragg's army was routed in turn by Maj. Gen. Ulysses S. Grant in the battles for Chattanooga. Throughout these campaigns, Bragg fought almost as bitterly against some of his uncooperative subordinates as he did against the enemy, and they made multiple attempts to have him replaced as army commander. The defeat at Chattanooga was the last straw, and Bragg was recalled in early 1864 to Richmond, where he became the military advisor to Confederate President Jefferson Davis. Near the end of the war, he defended Wilmington, North Carolina, and served as a corps commander in the Carolinas campaign. After the war, Bragg worked as the superintendent of the New Orleans Waterworks, a supervisor of harbor improvements at Mobile, Alabama, and as a railroad engineer and inspector in Texas. Early life. Bragg was born in Warrenton, North Carolina, one of the 6 sons of Thomas and Margaret Crossland Bragg. One of his older brothers was future Confederate Attorney General Thomas Bragg. He was often ridiculed as a child because of rumors about his mother's prison sentence for allegedly murdering an African-American freeman, and some of those rumors stated that he was born in prison. Grady McQuiney, the principal biographer of Bragg's early life and career, states that despite these rumors, the Bragg family was law-abiding. Although considered by his neighbors to be from the lower class, Thomas Bragg was a carpenter and contractor who became wealthy enough to send Braxton to the Warrenton Male Academy, one of the best schools in the state. He was descended from Thomas Bragg, who was born in England and settled in the colony of Virginia. In the thousands of letters that Bragg wrote during his lifetime, he spoke fondly of his father, but never mentioned his mother. West Point. When Bragg was only 10 years old, his father decided on a military career for him and sought ways to obtain a nomination to the United States Military Academy. Eventually, the oldest Bragg son, John, recently elected as a state legislator, obtained the support of U.S. Senator Willie P. Mangum, and West Point admitted Braxton at the age of 16. His classmates included notable future Civil War generals Joseph Hooker, John C. Pemberton, Jubilee Early, John Sedgwick, and William H. T. Walker. He did well in academic pursuits because of his superior memory, rather than industrious study, and received fewer disciplinary demerits than most of his contemporaries. He graduated 5th of 50 cadets from the West Point class of 1837 and was commissioned as second lieutenant in the 3rd U.S. Artillery. Early Army service. Bragg served in the Second Seminole War in Florida, initially as an assistant commissary officer and regimental adjutant, seeing no actual combat. He soon began to suffer from a series of illnesses that he blamed on the tropical climate. He sought a medical transfer and was briefly assigned to recruiting duty in Philadelphia, but in October 1840 he was ordered back to Florida. He became a company commander in the 3rd Artillery and commanded Fort Marion, near St. Augustine. In this assignment, he stayed relatively healthy, but tended toward overwork, laboring administratively to improve the living conditions of his men. He launched a series of argumentative letters with senior Army officials, including the Adjutant General and Army Paymaster, that established his reputation as disputatious. Bragg had a reputation for being a strict disciplinarian and one who adhered to regulations. Literally. There is a famous, apocryphal story, included in Ulysses S. Grant's memoirs, about Bragg as a company commander at a frontier post where he also served as quartermaster. He submitted a requisition for supplies for his company, then as quartermaster declined to fill it. As company commander, he resubmitted the requisition, giving additional reasons for his requirements. But as the quartermaster he denied the request again. Realizing that he was at a personal impasse, he referred the matter to the post commandant, who exclaimed, "My God, Mr. Bragg, you have quarreled with every officer in the army, and now you are quarreling with yourself." It is alleged that some of his troops attempted to assassinate him on 2 occasions in August and September 1847, but he was not injured either time. In the more serious of the 2 incidents, one of his soldiers exploded a 12-pound artillery shell underneath his cot. Although the cot was destroyed, somehow Bragg himself emerged without a scratch. Bragg had suspicions about the identity of the perpetrator, but had insufficient evidence to bring charges. Later, an Army deserter named Samuel R. Church claimed credit for the attack. The 3rd Artillery relocated to Fort Moultrie, Charleston, South Carolina, in 1843. Here, Bragg was stationed with 3 future Union Army generals that he came to consider close friends: George H. Thomas, John F. Reynolds and William T. Sherman. Bragg continued his controversial writing, this time a series of 9 articles published 1844–45 in the Southern Literary Messenger. The series, Notes on Our Army, published anonymously, included specific attacks on the policies of General-in-Chief Winfield Scott, whom he called a vain, petty, conniving man. There were also numerous attacks on Army administrative policies and officers. He included thoughtful recommendations on a proposed structure for the Army General Staff, which were echoed in reorganizations that occurred in the early 20th century, but were ignored at the time. His actions established Bragg's distinction as the most cantankerous man in the Army. He had been court-martialed and convicted. He had been censored by the Secretary of War, the Adjutant General, and the commander of the Eastern Division. No other junior officer could boast of so many high-ranking enemies. Both the commander of the 3rd Artillery and the commanding general of the United States Army hated Bragg. His future in his regiment and in the Army seemed most uncertain. Grady McQuiney, Braxton Bragg and Confederate defeat. Bragg's articles came to the attention of Representative James G. Clinton, a New York Democrat and political opponent of Scott's. While Bragg was on leave in Washington, D.C., in March 1844, Clinton called him to testify before his House Committee on Public Expenditures. Scott ordered him not to testify, in defiance of the congressional subpoena. Bragg was arrested and sent to Fort Monroe, Virginia, where he was court-martialed for disobedience to orders and disrespect toward his superior officers. Bragg conducted his own defense and attempted to turn the trial into a condemnation of Scott. He was found guilty, but an official reprimand from the Secretary of War and suspension at half pay for 2 months were relatively mild punishments, and Bragg was not deterred from future criticisms of his superiors. Mexican-American War. On March 1, 1845, Bragg and his artillery company were ordered to join Gen. Zachary Taylor in the defense of Texas from Mexico. He won promotions for bravery and distinguished conduct in the Mexican-American War, including a brevet promotion to captain for the Battle of Fort Brown, to major for the Battle of Monterey, and to lieutenant colonel for the Battle of Buena Vista. Bragg was also promoted to captain within the regular army in June 1846. He became widely admired in Taylor's army for the discipline and drill of his men and the newly tried tactics of light artillery that proved decisive in most of his engagements against the Mexican army. But it was Buena Vista that brought him national fame. His timely placement of artillery into a gap in the line helped repulse a numerically superior Mexican attack. He fought in support of Carl, Jefferson Davis and the Mississippi Rifles, which earned him the admiration of the future U.S. Secretary of War and President of the Confederacy. An anecdote circulated about Gen. Taylor commanding a little more of the grape, Captain Bragg, which caused him to redouble his efforts and save the day. The stories are probably apocryphal. Nevertheless, Bragg returned to the United States as a popular hero. A northwestern outpost, Fort Bragg, California, was named in his honor. The citizens of Warrenton presented him with a ceremonial sword. Congressman David Outlaw wrote about the honor. Carl Bragg, having, no thanks to them, won for himself a brilliant reputation, is now the object of the most fulsome adulation. Those who formerly sneered at the Braggs as plebeians, as unfit associates for them, they are glad to honor. With what scorn must Carl Bragg, in his secret heart, regard him. Bragg traveled to New York, Washington, Mobile, and New Orleans, and in each place he was honored. Marriage and civilian life. On his celebratory tour, Bragg visited Evergreen Plantation in Thibodaux, Louisiana, where he met 23-year-old Eliza Brooks Ellis, known to her friends as Elise, a wealthy sugar heiress. They were married on June 7, 1849. The newlyweds relocated to Jefferson Barracks, Missouri, on September 10. They were forced to leave this relatively comfortable assignment in October 1853 when they were transferred to Fort Gibson in the Indian Territory. 8 months later, they were transferred to Fort Washita, near the Texas border. The primitive conditions at these forts were unsuitable for the married couple, and after another 6 months Bragg requested leave, and the couple returned to Thibodaux. Bragg traveled to Washington to implore Secretary of War Jefferson Davis to reassign his artillery battery away from frontier duty, but was unsuccessful. On December 31, 1855, Bragg submitted his resignation from the Army, which became effective on January 3, 1856. He and his wife purchased a sugar plantation of 1,600 acres 3 miles north of Thibodaux. Never one to oppose slavery in concept, both his father and his wife were slave owners. He used 105 slaves on his property. There is no evidence that he was a cruel slave owner, but he continued to uphold his reputation as being a stern disciplinarian and an advocate of military efficiency. His methods resulted in almost immediate profitability, despite a large mortgage on the property. He became active in local politics and was elected to the Board of Public Works in 1860. Throughout the 1850s, Bragg had been disturbed by the accelerating sectional crisis. He opposed the concept of secession, believing that in a republic no majority could set aside a written constitution. But this belief would soon be tested.